The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the kind that sits in a pot too long and turns bitter. I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at the linoleum floor where a scuff mark shaped like a crescent moon caught my eye. My heart was racing, not because of the diagnosis I'd just received, but because I knew I'd have to tell Ethan. I'd have to look into his eyes, those hazel eyes that could charm a room or cut you down with a glance, and ask for his support. Dr. Linda Hayes had just laid it all out for me. A growth in my abdomen, likely benign, but possibly not, needed to come out. Soon. Surgery wasn't optional. It was a matter of when, not if. I could still hear her voice, calm but firm, saying, "Sarah, you can't wait on this. Delaying could make things worse." I drove home that evening, the Chicago skyline fading into a blur of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Our suburban street was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air knows something you don't. Ethan was in the living room when I walked in, sprawled on the couch, his laptop open to some spreadsheet for his latest business idea. He barely looked up. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice distracted, like I was just another notification he'd swipe away. I stood there, my purse still slung over my shoulder, and told him. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told him about the growth, the surgery, the urgency. I waited for him to stand up, to hug me, to say something, anything, that would make me feel like we were in this together, dot instead, comma. He frowned, his brow creasing like I'd just handed him a bill he couldn't pay. "How much is this going to cost?" he asked, setting the laptop on the coffee table. His tone wasn't cruel, just practical, like he was sizing up a car repair. I told him Dr. Hayes had mentioned it could be upwards of $30,000, maybe more, with follow-ups. His eyes widened and he leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, we can't afford that. You know how tight things are right now. The business is just starting to pick up. Can't you, I don't know, wait a bit. See if it gets better?" I stood there, frozen, the weight of his words sinking into me like cold water seeping through a crack. Wait? This wasn't a headache or a sprained ankle. This was my body, my life. But Ethan had this way of making his logic sound like the only logic, like my fears were just noise he could tune out. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see me. Instead, I nodded, my throat tight. "Okay," I whispered. "Maybe we can figure something out." That night, I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling while he snored softly. I thought about my mom years ago, standing in our old kitchen in Indiana, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for Sunday dinner. She'd always said, "Sarah, love means carrying each other's burdens, not adding to them." I wondered what she'd think of me now, agreeing to put my health on hold because Ethan thought it was too expensive. I felt like I was betraying her, betraying myself. The next morning, I called Rachel, my best friend since college. We met at a diner on Clark Street, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and waitresses who call you hon. Rachel listened as I spilled everything, her dark eyes narrowing with every word. She stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug, and said, "Sarah, you can't let him do this to you. This isn't about money. This is about him not wanting to deal with it." Her words stung because they were true. Rachel had always seen through Ethan's charm, his easy smile that hid a man who lived for the moment, consequences be damned. She reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "You're worth more than this. You know that, right?" I wanted to believe her, but doubt clung to me like damp clothes. Ethan and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5. I'd always been the one to bend, to smooth things over. I was the freelance writer who could work from anywhere, who could skip a deadline to make dinner or drive him to a meeting when his car broke down. My life had always been flexible, moldable, like clay in his hands. But this was different. This was my body telling me it couldn't wait, and I was ignoring it. Months passed, and I didn't get better. The pain in my abdomen came and went. Sometimes a dull ache, sometimes sharp enough to make me double over. I'd be in the middle of writing an article, my laptop balanced on the kitchen table, and I'd have to stop, press my hand against my side, and breathe through it. Ethan noticed sometimes. He'd ask, "You okay?" But it was the kind of question that didn't expect an answer. I'd nod, force a smile, and keep going. I told myself we'd find a way to pay for the surgery soon, that Ethan's business would stabilize, that things would get better. I told myself a lot of things. I started avoiding mirrors, not because of vanity, but because I didn't recognize the woman looking back. My dark hair, once thick and shiny, hung limp. My eyes, always bright, looked tired, like they'd seen too much. I'd catch myself thinking about my childhood, about the summer I was 10, running through the sprinkler in our backyard while Dad grilled burgers. The air smelled of charcoal and wet grass, and I felt invincible. Now, at 32, I felt like I was fading, like the color was draining out of me. One evening, I was washing dishes, the warm water soothing my hands when Ethan came home. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "I need to talk to you," he said, sitting at the kitchen table. His voice was different, urgent, almost scared. He told me he'd been to the doctor. A routine checkup had turned into tests, then more tests, and now a diagnosis. A growth just like mine, but in his chest. Surgery was non negotiable, the doctor said. It had to happen soon, or it could spread. I listened, the dish sponge dripping in my hand, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not anger, just a quiet, hollow space where something should have been. "How much?" I asked, my voice steady. He hesitated, then said, "About $35,000, maybe more." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, like he was waiting for me to fix it. "Sarah, we have to do this. I can't risk waiting." I set the sponge down, dried my hands on a towel, and looked at him. Really looked at him. His broad shoulders, his strong jaw, the man I'd loved for so long. And I saw it. Saw how he'd never once asked how I was feeling, how he'd dismissed my pain because it didn't fit his plans. I saw the life we'd built, the one where I was always the one to give, to wait, to sacrifice. And in that moment, something inside me shifted like a lock clicking into place. "I know," I said softly. "We'll figure it out, but I wasn't sure we would. Not together. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Ethan was frantic, his usual confidence replaced by a jittery energy that filled our house like static. He'd pace the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, talking to insurance agents, doctors, anyone who might have answers. I watched him from the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup I'd made to keep my hands busy. The steam rose in lazy curls, and I found myself staring at it, wondering how we'd gotten here. How the man who'd once promised to love me through anything could look at my pain and see a price tag. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would come later, slow and simmering like a pot left too long on the stove. For now, I was just tired. Tired of the ache in my side that never quite went away. Tired of the way Ethan's voice softened when he talked about his surgery, but never about mine. Tired of the way I'd let myself shrink to fit his world. I'd always been the one to make things work, balancing our budget, picking up extra writing gigs, cooking dinner even when I could barely stand. But now, with his diagnosis hanging over us, I felt something new. A quiet resolve, like a seed buried deep, waiting for the right moment to break through. I called Dr. Hayes the next morning, my voice low so Ethan wouldn't hear. She'd been my doctor for years, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense way of cutting through excuses. "Sarah," she said, her voice steady through the phone, "your condition hasn't improved. If anything, the scans show it's progressing. We need to schedule your surgery soon." I closed my eyes, picturing her office, the worn leather chair, the framed photo of her kids on the desk, the faint smell of lavender from a diffuser. I told her about Ethan's diagnosis, about the cost, about how we couldn't afford both surgeries. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You can't keep putting yourself last. You're not helping anyone by doing that." Her words stayed with me like a pebble in my shoe. I wanted to believe I could be strong, that I could stand up for myself. But every time I looked at Ethan, I saw the boy I'd met 8 years ago at a friend's barbecue. The one who'd made me laugh until my sides hurt, who danced with me under a string of fairy lights while everyone else was too drunk to notice. He'd been different then, or maybe I'd just seen what I wanted to see. Either way, that Ethan was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't see past his own needs. One afternoon, I drove to the lakefront to clear my head. Lake Michigan stretched out like a sheet of glass, the horizon smudged with clouds. I sat on a bench, my coat pulled tight against the October chill, and watched a group of kids chase each other near the water. Their laughter carried on the wind, sharp and bright, and I remembered being that age, running through my grandparents' farm in Indiana. I'd climb the old oak tree by the barn, my hands sticky with sap, and sit there for hours dreaming about the life I'd have one day. I'd wanted to be a writer, to tell stories that made people feel something. Now I was living a story I didn't know how to write. Rachel called me that evening, her voice cutting through the fog in my head. You need to get out of that house, she said. Meet me at the bookstore on Michigan Avenue. You know, the one with the creaky floors? I didn't want to go, but I knew Rachel wouldn't let up. So I drove downtown, the city lights blurring through a light drizzle. The bookstore was warm and smelled of old paper and coffee. Rachel was already there, flipping through a novel, her glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when I walked in, her face softening. You look like hell, she said, not unkindly. We wandered the aisles, talking in hushed tones. I told her about Ethan's surgery, about the cost, about how he expected me to make it work. She stopped in the middle of the fiction section, her hand resting on a copy of Pride and Prejudice Asterisk. Sarah, she said, her voice low but fierce. He didn't care when it was you. Why should you care now? I opened my mouth to argue, to say something about love or duty, but nothing came out. She was right, and that truth sat heavy in my chest like a stone I couldn't dislodge. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, trying to map out our finances. Ethan's business had been bleeding money for months, his big ideas always one step away from paying off. My freelance work kept us afloat, but barely. I looked at the numbers, our savings, my income, the bills piling up, and realized there was no way to pay for both surgeries, not without going into debt that would drown us. I thought about what Rachel had said, about what Dr. Hayes had said. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who climbed trees and dreamed big. And I made a decision. The next morning, I told Ethan we needed to talk. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his face pale but determined. I sat across from him, my hands steady for the first time in months. I've been thinking, I said, my voice calm but firm. We can't afford both surgeries, you know that, so I'm going to schedule mine first. His eyes widened, his mouth opening to protest, but I kept going. You told me to wait, and I did. I've been waiting for a year, Ethan. I've been in pain, and I've been scared, and you didn't care. Now it's my turn. He stared at me, his face a mix of shock and something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear? Sarah, come on, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You know I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to keep us from going under. My surgery. It's urgent. The doctor said, I know what the doctor said, I cut in. I've heard it before, from my doctor. About me. I stood up, my hands trembling, but my resolve steady. I'm not saying you won't get your surgery. I'm saying I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not putting my life on hold for you. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said in years. Ethan looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and I wondered if he saw the woman he'd married or someone else entirely. I didn't wait for him to answer. I walked to the bedroom, closed the door, and called Dr. Hayes to schedule my surgery. My hands shook as I dialed, but my heart felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of something I'd been carrying too long. The next few weeks were strange, like living in a house that wasn't quite ours anymore. Ethan was quieter, his charm dimmed by worry. I focused on preparing for my surgery, meeting with Dr. Hayes, filling out forms, and trying not to think about the cost. Rachel came over often, bringing takeout and bad jokes to keep me grounded. One night, as we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, the air crisp with the promise of winter, she said, You're doing the right thing, you know. You're choosing yourself. I nodded, but part of me still wondered if I was being selfish, if I was breaking some unspoken vow. The day before my surgery, I sat in the backyard watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The grass was damp from an earlier rain, and I could smell the earth, rich and alive. I thought about my mom again, about the way she'd always known when to stand her ground. I wished she were here to tell me I was doing the right thing, to hold my hand through this. But I knew deep down that I had to do this alone. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. The hospital was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you wish for a thicker blanket. I lay in the pre-op room, the IV line tugging at my arm, the beeping of monitors a steady rhythm in the background. Dr. Hayes came in, her face calm but focused. Her scrubs a soft blue that reminded me of the lake on a clear day. She squeezed my hand and said, "You're going to be okay, Sarah. We're taking care of this." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my eyes sting. For the first time in months, I felt seen. Like my life mattered to someone other than me. Ethan had driven me to the hospital that morning, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set. He hadn't said much, just a quiet, "Good luck," as he dropped me off at the entrance. I didn't expect him to stay. Part of me didn't want him to. I needed this moment to be mine, not ours. Rachel was there instead, sitting in the waiting room with a dog-eared paperback and a thermos of coffee. She hugged me before I went in, her arms strong and warm, and whispered, "You've got this. I'm so proud of you." I clung to those words as they wheeled me into surgery, the ceiling tiles blurring above me like a movie reel dot. Waking up was like swimming through fog. My mouth was dry, my body heavy, but the pain in my side was different. Not gone, but softer, like a bruise instead of a blade. Dr. Hayes came by later, her voice gentle as she explained that the surgery had gone well. The growth was out, and the initial tests looked promising, though we'd need to wait for the full results. I nodded, too tired to speak, and let my eyes drift to the window. The Chicago skyline was just visible, a jagged line against the gray sky, and I felt a strange peace, like I'd crossed a threshold I didn't know I'd been approaching. Rachel drove me home the next day, the car filled with the smell of her lavender hand cream and the faint hum of the radio. She didn't ask about Ethan, and I was grateful for that. Our house felt different when I walked in, quieter somehow, like it was holding its breath. Ethan was at a meeting, or so he'd texted, and I was glad for the space. I settled on the couch, a blanket over my legs, and stared at the coffee table where a stack of my notebooks sat, filled with half-finished articles and story ideas I hadn't touched in months. I thought about the girl who used to write poetry in the margins of her school books, the one who believed words could change the world. I wondered where she'd gone. Recovery was slow, each day a small battle against pain and fatigue. I'd shuffle to the kitchen for tea, my movements careful, and sit at the table, watching the light shift across the backyard. Sometimes I'd catch myself remembering little things: a summer picnic with my parents, the smell of my mom's perfume when she hugged me, the way my dad used to whistle off key while fixing the car. Those memories felt like anchors keeping me steady as I navigated the uncertainty of my healing body and my crumbling marriage. Ethan was different after my surgery, quieter, less sure of himself. He'd ask how I was feeling, but his questions felt careful, like he was testing the waters. I'd answer in short sentences, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I'd spent so long bending to his needs, and now I was standing upright, and it felt like we were speaking different languages. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, the silence thick between us, he said, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't I didn't realize how bad it was for you." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd once made me believe in forever. But apologies don't erase pain, and I wasn't sure what to do with his words. I looked at him, my fork resting on my plate. "I needed you, Ethan," I said softly. "I needed you to see me, not just the cost." He nodded, his eyes dropping to his hands, and I knew he didn't have an answer. Maybe he never would. A week later, I was strong enough to meet Rachel for coffee at our usual diner. The jukebox was playing an old Springsteen song, and the air smelled of bacon and syrup. She slid into the booth across from me, her eyes scanning my face like she was checking for cracks. "You look better," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "Not great, but better." I laughed, the sound surprising me, and told her about the surgery, about Ethan's apology, about the strange quiet that had settled over my life. She listened, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, and then said, "You're not done yet, you know. This isn't just about the surgery, it's about what comes next." Her words stuck with me, like a song I couldn't stop humming. What came next? I'd spent so long focused on surviving, on getting through the pain, the fear, the surgery, that I hadn't thought about the life I wanted to build after. I started writing again, small things at first, like journal entries about the way the morning light hit the kitchen counter or the sound of the neighbor's dog barking at dawn. It felt good, like stretching a muscle I'd forgotten I had. I even pitched a few articles, my fingers trembling as I hit send, But the responses were encouraging, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward. Ethan's surgery was scheduled a month after mine. The cost loomed over us like a storm cloud, and I knew we couldn't avoid it forever. I'd been researching options, loans, payment plans, anything to make it work. But every time I looked at the numbers, I felt that old resentment bubbling up. He hadn't fought for me when I needed him. Why was I fighting for him now? I thought about what Rachel had said, about choosing myself, and I realized I didn't want to carry his burden alone anymore. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the driveway, I sat Ethan down. The living room was dim, the only light coming from a lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the floor. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I'll help you with the surgery, but not the way you expect. I'm not going to drain our savings or take on debt we can't handle. I'm setting up a GoFundMe for you. I'll share it, I'll ask for help, but I'm not sacrificing my recovery for yours." His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words. "Sarah, you can't be serious," he said finally, his voice low. "A GoFundMe? That's that's humiliating." I looked at him, at the man who'd once told me my surgery was too expensive, and felt a calm certainty settle over me. "It's what we can do," I said, "and I'm going to be honest in the post. I'm going to tell our story, my surgery, your decision, everything. People deserve to know the truth." He stared at me, his eyes wide with something between fear and anger, but I didn't back down. For the first time, I felt like I was writing my own story, not just living in his. I set up the GoFundMe that night, my fingers steady as I typed. I didn't sugarcoat it. I wrote about my diagnosis, about waiting in pain because Ethan thought we couldn't afford it, about choosing myself when I couldn't wait anymore. I wrote about his surgery, about the cost, about the reality of our situation. I didn't write to shame him, but to be honest, to let the world see us as we were: flawed, human, struggling. I hit publish and closed my laptop, my heart pounding, but my mind clear. The GoFundMe post went live just as the snow began to stick, blanketing our suburban street in a quiet white hush. I didn't check it right away. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling up like a question mark, and sat at the kitchen table, my laptop closed. The house was still. Ethan upstairs in the bedroom, probably staring at his phone, grappling with the reality of what I'd done. I didn't feel triumphant or vengeful, just steady, like I'd finally planted my feet on a solid ground after years of walking on sand. By morning, the post had spread. Rachel texted me first, a string of exclamation points followed by, "Sarah, you're a badass." I laughed despite myself, but my stomach twisted as I opened the page. The donations were small at first: $20 from a coworker, $50 from an old college friend, $10 from a stranger with a note that said, "You're stronger than you know." But it wasn't the money that caught me off guard, it was the comments. People I hadn't spoken to in years, neighbors I'd only waved to, even a few of Ethan's clients. They were all there, their words piling up like letters in a mailbox. "I had no idea you were going through this," one wrote. "Thank you for being so honest," said another. A woman from my book club added, "You deserve to be seen, Sarah. Keep fighting." I scrolled through, my eyes burning, not just from the support, but from the realization that my story, our story, had touched something in people. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, shrinking to fit Ethan's world, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be heard. But there were other comments too, ones that stung. A few of Ethan's friends called me out, saying I was airing dirty laundry, that I should have kept it private. One even wrote, "This is low, Sarah. He's your husband." I stared at that one for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen, wondering if they were right. Was I being cruel? Was this revenge? But then I remembered the months of pain, the way I'd begged Ethan to listen, the way he'd looked right through me. This wasn't revenge, it was truth. Ethan saw the post that afternoon. I was in the living room, curled up with a blanket and a book I wasn't really reading, when he stormed in, his face flushed. "You really did it," he said, his voice tight like a string about to snap. "You told everyone I'm some kind of monster." I set the book down, my hand steady despite the pounding in my chest. "I told the truth," I said. "I told our story, Ethan. Not just yours, not just mine. Ours." He paced, his hands running through his hair, and for a moment I saw the fear behind his anger. He wasn't just mad about the post, he was scared of losing control, of being seen as the man who'd let his wife suffer. You could have talked to me first, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. We could have figured it out together. I looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, and felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, or the ghost of love. I tried talking to you, I said quietly. For a year, I tried. You didn't listen. He didn't have an answer for that, and the silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we couldn't say, Dot. The GoFundMe gained traction over the next few days, shared across social media by friends, then strangers, then a local news outlet that picked up the story. They called it A Wife's Courage, focusing on my decision to prioritize my health and speak out. I cringed at the headline. It felt too dramatic, too much like a Lifetime movie. But part of me was grateful. The donations climbed, enough to cover Ethan's surgery with some left over for follow-up care. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt exposed, like I'd opened a window into our lives and now the world was peering in. Rachel came over one evening, her boots tracking snow into the kitchen. She handed me a bottle of wine and said, "You're famous, you know." I rolled my eyes, but she wasn't entirely wrong. My inbox was flooded with messages, some from women who'd been in similar situations, others from people offering advice or prayers. One email from a woman named Karen in Ohio stuck with me. She wrote about her own marriage, how she'd spent years putting her husband's needs first, only to realize he'd never do the same for her. Your story gave me the push I needed, she wrote. I'm leaving him next week. I read it over and over, my heart aching for her, but also swelling with something like pride. My words, my truth had reached someone. Ethan's surgery was scheduled for the following week. I drove him to the hospital, the same one where I'd had mine, the familiar antiseptic smell hitting me as we walked through the doors. He was quiet, his hands fidgeting in his lap, and I wondered what he was thinking. Was he scared? Ashamed? Grateful? I didn't ask. I didn't have the energy to carry his emotions anymore. Rachel was there again, her presence a steady anchor, and she squeezed my hand as they wheeled Ethan into pre-op. You're doing more than most would, she said, her voice low. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed her. The surgery went well, according to the doctor. Ethan would need time to recover, but the prognosis was good. I sat in the waiting room staring at the same crescent-shaped scuff mark on the floor I'd noticed a month ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then, like I was a different person looking at the same mark. When Ethan woke up, I was there, not because I wanted to be his savior, but because I wasn't ready to let go of the part of me that still cared. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with painkillers, and said, "Thank you, Sarah." His voice was soft, almost broken, and I nodded, unable to find words. When we got home, the house felt different again, like it was waiting for us to decide what it would become. Ethan moved slowly, his recovery mirroring mine in a way that felt almost poetic. We didn't talk much, but there were moments. Him handing me a cup of coffee in the morning, me adjusting his pillow at night. That felt like small steps toward something. Not reconciliation, not yet, but maybe understanding. I kept writing, pouring my thoughts into articles and essays, some of which were picked up by bigger publications. The GoFundMe had given me a platform, and I used it, not to dwell on our story, but to talk about the bigger picture, the way the healthcare system forces impossible choices, the way love can bend under the weight of those choices. People responded, and I started to feel like the writer I'd always wanted to be, the one who could make people feel something. One evening, as spring crept into Chicago, I sat on the porch, the air warm with the promise of new beginnings. Ethan joined me, his steps careful but stronger than they'd been. He sat beside me, his hands resting on his knees, and said, "I've been thinking about us." I looked at him, at the man I'd loved and resented, and waited. "I messed up, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I didn't see you, not really. I want to try again, if you'll let me." I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the street, at the cherry blossoms blooming across the way, and thought about the girl who'd climbed trees, the woman who'd chosen herself. I wasn't sure if I could trust Ethan again, but I knew I could trust myself. "I don't know what that looks like," I said finally, my voice steady, "but I'm not going anywhere yet." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for now. The air was soft, the sky streaked with pink, and I felt a quiet strength, like I'd finally written the first chapter of a story that was mine to tell. The porch was warm that evening, the kind of warmth that wraps around you like a soft blanket, promising summer just around the corner. Ethan sat beside me, his hands still on his knees, his words hanging in the air like a question neither of us could fully answer. I looked out at the cherry blossoms, their pink petals catching the last light of the day, and felt the weight of his request to try again, to rebuild what we'd lost. My heart didn't leap at the idea, nor did it close off completely. It just sat there, steady, like a stone smoothed by years of river water. I'd changed, and I wasn't sure he understood how much. The weeks that followed were a dance of careful steps. Ethan tried, in his way. He'd bring me coffee in the morning, the mug warm in my hands, or ask about my writing with a sincerity I hadn't heard in years. But his efforts felt like echoes of a man I used to know, not the one sitting across from me now. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes, his hazel eyes searching for something, forgiveness maybe, or a sign that I was still his. I didn't have an answer for him. I was too busy learning who I was outside of his shadow. My writing took on a life of its own. The articles I'd started pitching after the GoFundMe began to gain traction, not just locally, but beyond Chicago. A magazine in New York asked me to write a longer piece about the healthcare system, about the choices it forces on people like me, like Ethan. I poured myself into it, sitting at the kitchen table late into the night, the glow of my laptop casting shadows across the room. I wrote about the pain of waiting, the fear of being unseen, the quiet strength that comes from choosing yourself. When the piece was published, it hit a nerve. Emails poured in from readers, women who'd put their own needs last, men who saw themselves in Ethan's mistakes, families grappling with the same impossible choices. I read each one, my heart swelling and aching in equal measure, like a bruise that feels tender but alive. Ethan's recovery was slower than mine, in his body taking longer to heal. He moved through the house like a ghost, quiet, careful, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance we'd struck. He went back to work, but his business, already shaky, faltered further. Clients who'd seen the GoFundMe post started pulling away, their trust in him shaken by the story I'd told. I heard whispers from mutual friends, comments about his selfishness, his pride, how he'd let me down when I needed him most. He never mentioned it, but I saw it in the way he carried himself. His shoulders hunched, his charm dimmed. He was paying a price, not in dollars, but in the currency of reputation, of respect. I didn't feel satisfaction at his loss, only a quiet sadness, like watching a tree you'd once loved lose its leaves to winter. One morning, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the steam curling up like a memory, I found myself thinking about my mom again. I could still see her in our old kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her voice soft but firm as she said, "Sarah, love means carrying each other's burdens, not adding to them." I'd carried Ethan's burdens for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand unweighted. Now, I was learning. I'd started saying no to last-minute requests, to the endless cycle of putting his needs first. I took walks by Lake Michigan, the water glinting like a promise, and let myself dream again. Not of the life we'd planned together, but of a life that was mine. Rachel noticed the change. We met at our usual diner, the jukebox humming an old Dylan tune, the air thick with the smell of coffee and pancakes. She leaned across the table, her eyes bright, and said, "You're different, Sarah. Not just stronger, freer." I smiled, stirring my coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the mug. She was right. I wasn't the woman who'd agreed to delay her surgery, who'd let Ethan's logic drown out her own. I was someone new, someone who could look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back. Dark hair, still a little limp, but eyes brighter, like they'd remembered how to shine. Ethan and I had one last big conversation a month after his surgery. It was late, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. We sat in the living room, the lamp casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He looked at me, his face tired but open, and said, "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I want to make it right, Sarah, but I don't know how." His voice was raw, like he'd been carrying the words for weeks, letting them cut into him. I looked at him, at the man I'd loved through so many seasons, and felt an ache for what we'd been. But I also felt something else, a clarity, sharp and clean, like the first breath of air after a long dive. "I don't know if you can make it right," I said, my voice steady but not unkind. "It's not about fixing the past, Ethan. It's about what we do now. I've spent years bending to fit your life, and I can't do that anymore. I need to be me, not just your wife. He nodded, his eyes dropping to his hands, and I saw the weight of my words settle on him. Not anger, not defiance, just truth, heavy and undeniable. He didn't argue, didn't try to charm his way out. Maybe he was learning too. I moved out a few weeks later, not in a rush or a fury, but with a quiet purpose. I found a small apartment in the city, a place with big windows and a view of the skyline. The kind of place I'd dreamed of as a girl. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I filled it with things that felt like me. A secondhand bookshelf stuffed with novels, a quilt my mom had made, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim that I couldn't bear to throw out. I kept writing, my words finding their way to more readers, more hearts. A literary agent reached out, asking if I'd ever considered a book. I hadn't, not really, but the idea took root. Like a seed I hadn't known I'd planted. Ethan and I didn't divorce, not yet. We agreed to separate, to give ourselves space to breathe, to figure out who we were without each other. He stayed in the house, the one we'd filled with dreams that didn't quite fit anymore. I heard from friends that he was trying to rebuild his business, taking smaller jobs, working longer hours. He called sometimes, his voice tentative, asking how I was, telling me about his day. I listened, answered, but kept my heart at a distance, not out of anger, but because I needed to protect the woman I was becoming. One evening, I walked to the lakefront, the air cool and crisp, the water lapping gently against the shore. The sky was a deep purple, streaked with gold, and I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who'd climbed trees and believed in forever. I wasn't that girl anymore, but I wasn't lost either. I'd found something better, a strength that didn't need to shout, a voice that didn't need permission. I'd learned that love isn't about carrying someone else's burdens at the cost of your own. It's about standing side by side, each holding your own weight, choosing each other every day. I stopped by the water's edge, picked up a smooth, flat stone, and skipped it across the surface. It bounced once, twice, 3 times before sinking, leaving ripples that spread and faded. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I was here, alive, writing my own story. And that was enough.